Hi everyone. I just want to start off by saying I really enjoyed everyone's videos and I learned something new from each of you. And I definitely took away from your responses and your opinions and what you noticed throughout this section. So thank you for that. First, I'm going to start off with Amanda and her video. And I just want to start off by saying thank you for being honest about not knowing or not being aware of the differences between racism, prejudice, discrimination. I was the exact same way, and I think a lot of people in society probably are, because we use these terms so interchangeably that we don't really realize that they are different and separate. I didn't actually learn about the difference between them until I was in my undergrad, and I had a class about social justice, where this was kind of honed on about how separate and different they each are, because it probably is a really big issue that people, and especially the educators of that class, realize that people don't separate those interchangeably and that we use them interchangeably to describe things that might not match the term, if that makes sense. So thank you for being honest about that. It was definitely good to have a refresher for this because they can be confusing, and since they are used so much interchangeably in society, it is confusing to kind of keep them separate, so I really appreciated that. Excuse me. So you also talked about how cognitive development of children is affected by not being exposed to diversity. And you mentioned this when you talked about how students were asked about their neighborhoods and they all raised their hands if they lived in neighborhoods that had people that were like them. And this kind of made me begin to reflect on my own childhood and my own upbringing, because when I think back on it, I wasn't really introduced to diversity much. I went to a church that people that looked like me. I lived in a neighborhood with people that looked like me. I went to schools with students who were diverse, but I was a shy student, so I didn't actually talk to many people. Therefore, I wasn't exposed to different cultures, different opinions, upbringings, and so I do kind of reflect this. I did have family members who were old school and kind of had those old school thoughts. Luckily for me, I was a very open-minded child, and even though I wasn't really introduced to diversity, luckily I have remained open-minded and definitely went to a school in my undergrad that helped me appreciate diversity and made me want to learn more about other people. So I thought that was interesting to kind of reflect on. Next, I'm going to talk about Tyler's video. I really enjoyed your section where you talked about invisibility to bigotry, and then how you brought up disconscious racism. Definitely don't think I'm pronouncing that right either. But I think invisibility to bigotry is something that happens all the time. For me, I didn't realize that it was such a big problem because I didn't have people around me who were in those cultures that were being affected. And so I didn't know, I didn't ask, just because I didn't know and I was ignorant about it. But I realized it was an issue during my undergrad because we had a speaker come and actually speak about his experiences, his culture being appropriated with the Redskins. And he talked about the Redskins and how the history of the Redskins, like what it was and why it was so offensive. And so that definitely enlightened me and made me learn about this type of racism because I didn't know it was a thing and I was just ignorant to that situation. But I'm glad you mentioned it. And you also mentioned stereotypes. And this is another big problem in our society. And it affects a lot of people, whether it's gender, racism, religion, Greek life, what you're involved in, hobbies. Everyone experiences it, and I've experienced it just by being in a sorority. I think the media likes to kind of portray stereotypes in different ways in movies and stuff like that, and that's where society kind of gets this from. And maybe they think it's okay because it's in a movie, and they don't know any better. It's an unfortunate fact, but it happens a lot. It's something that we need to work on changing, even though we mention it a lot. It needs to happen more. But thank you for your insights, and I enjoyed your video as well. And then lastly, we have Courtney. You mentioned a friend who struggled with feeling like she had to pick between her cultures, and I actually didn't realize that this was a thing until my undergrad. Being in social work classes, I had the opportunity to hear different people's perspectives and actually learned that this was a real thing that people struggled with. For me, I don't know my background or my culture or anything like that, unfortunately, so I haven't really had a struggle with it. But it is really interesting to me how some people, just recently, I heard someone say that they were they acted too white for the white or for the black community, but then the black community thought they acted too white. So I might have said that backwards, but it was just interesting to me how that's a thing. Unfortunately, it is a sad fact that people have to deal with that. So I appreciated you bringing that up. And then you also talked about how children who lived in segregated housing market receive inferior education. And I know this, I learned about this, about how environmental factors affect how we grow up. And so this is definitely a big issue. It's definitely evident in our society today. And I'm glad you brought it up because it's hard for students to really understand why they're receiving the education they are and why they have these advantages while others don't. So it's definitely prevalent in our society, and it was really interesting to hear about. So I enjoyed everyone's videos, and I cannot wait to see what everyone else has to say.